Okay, welcome to Tintincast, episode 12.
Already?
We have two books for you today. We have The Seven Crystal Balls and we have Prisoners of the Sun. And bear with us because it's a lot to get through. It's not even funny.
It's not.
So, Seven Crystal Balls. Hergé's the start of the last of his wartime adventures. And this started in Le Soir on 16th of December 1943, and the Soir newspaper was obviously the Nazi-controlled pirate edition of the newspaper. So at this time, the fortunes of the Nazis who were occupying Belgium at the time were starting to turn at this point in the war, and Hergé starts to foresee a time when his willingness to work under Nazi-controlled or far-right leaning newspapers might cause problems for him. And he writes about another publication that he's been asked to contribute to during the war. And he wrote at the time, I'm already considered a traitor for having published my drawings in Le Soir, for which I should be shot or hung. People haven't quite made up their minds about which one yet. The worst that can happen to me is that having been shot or hung for my collaboration with Le Soir, I will be reshot or rehung for my collaboration with Het Laatste Nieuws. And that's probably a very bad pronunciation of the newspaper he was being asked to work with as well. So there's all of this going on. But also, we should mention Edward P. Jacobs, who collaborated on the book. In fact, Jacobs contributed the whole Crystal Balls idea and the name of the book, the Seven Crystal Balls book. Jacobs also became the colorist on the preceding books that Casterman had now committed to re-releasing in color format. And Jacobs was also becoming a good friend to Hergé by this point, and apparently the two were often seen drinking and socializing together. So, Seven Crystal Balls and Prisoners of the Sun, they have this sort of duology structure that is quite similar to Secret of the Unicorn and Red Rackham's Treasure, the first book being the sort of mystery and the second part being the quest. And this is sort of going to become a theme for his duology books as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I wonder, because a few people have commented, obviously, that he had massive success with his War Years books because obviously he had the increased readership, but also he wasn't going political. And a lot of people, the critics, said that that was the making of Hergé, it was the making of Tintin, was that when it veered away from politics and it started to become more adventurous, that's when it became hugely successful. So I wonder if partly he chose to do a few two-parters during the Second World War because it spread out the ideas, and he didn't have to think of 5 or 6 different books during the war. He thought of 2 or 3 adventures and just extended them. But the effect is they're more epic, they're more grandiose, there's loads happening, they're more memorable. Although when I came to reread these, I mean, it's been years since I've reread these ones, I couldn't remember the stories of either of them. I couldn't remember at all. I just remember the lightning ball coming in because of the cover with calculus. And
it's pretty iconic, isn't it?
It's really iconic. I'd forgotten the plot of both of them. I just remembered, obviously, from the covers, you can tell what the kind of thing it's going to be. This is a kind of Indiana Jones jungle romp. And this is it's a calculus-heavy, slightly sciencey, eccentric adventure. But when I came to read them, I was like, oh yeah, I do remember these quite well. Now I'm reading them, but I couldn't have recalled them from memory because I love the start of the first one, Seven Crystal Balls, and you've got Haddock, Lord of Marlinspike, and he's just trying to play the Lord of the Manor. It's so brilliant.
He is hilarious in those first pages because Tintin's not moved into Marlinspike yet, so he sort of arrives on the train to see the captain and the professor. But when he turns up, Haddock with his horse, or not with his horse.
The horse arrives first. Oh, and here's his lordship. It's brilliant. Yeah, it's like he won't be long. It's such a great intro for Haddock, isn't it? His horse arrives. followed by Haddock's rubbing his back with his hat all bent. He's trying desperately to play the rich man of the landed gentry, but he just can't quite make it happen.
The jodhpurs and the multitude of monocles.
Yeah, and he tries to sort of sound posh as well, you know, and he's got butler Nesta now obviously working for him, and it's just a lovely setup. You've got, okay, you know, it's the time has moved on since Red Rackham's treasure. Haddock's got his inheritance, he's got his hall, so he's no longer this drunken wretch. He is a respectable gentleman, or at least he's trying to be a respectable gentleman, and he tries.
Well, he's dabbling in magic, isn't he? And magic is a bit of a theme in these books as well.
That's true, isn't it? Yes, good point. Yeah, he's obsessed with a magic trick, but mostly because it can turn water into whiskey, and that he thinks he can do it as well. Yeah, that first 20 pages or so of Marlin Spike, and you know, it's a real sort of side adventure with Haddock and Tintin go to the opera. Bianca Castafiore is there, which is brilliant.
It's a real greatest hits. I mean, I love the hippodrome scenes, and actually, I think looking back, this is probably the thing that maybe got me into theatre, my first job as well, because it looks such an exciting place. The way that Hergé has drawn it, you've got General Alcazar, of course, who's fallen on hard times. Who'd have thought it'd come down in the world from being the leader of San Theodorus?
Yeah, I know.
And then the great Bianca Castafiore comes out.
Yeah, singing the same aria that she sings every single time.
Which I think is the first time Haddock has ever seen Bianca Castafiore. I think this is his first experience of her, is it?
Yeah, that's right. And Tintin has to tell him. She turns up in the oddest places, Sildavia, Borduria of the Red Sea, which is really nice because he's just recapping. And then you've got obviously Calculus, who's obviously going to be a focus for this story. The Thompsons are there. The Thompsons are in fantastic form in these two books all the way through, I think. There's some really classic moments with them.
There is the lovely line where Thompson without a P introduces himself on the phone and says, "It's Thompson without a P, as in monstrosity."
Yeah, I love that. And I love the fact that Thompson with a P always uses words with a silent P, like pterodactyl and stuff, and pseudonym. It's Thompson with a P, as in pseudonym. Like, and they have some great double, you know, some great back and forth. One of them says, "All right, we can't deny that we're right as ever," and the other one goes, "Quite right. To be precise, we can deny that we're ever right." You know, and they've got that down by this point. The Thompsons are a fantastic comedy double act, especially like when he's on the phone and he really doesn't realize he's got his cane to his ear, and the phone receiver has fallen into the cradle of his arm.
Yeah, as you say, the first 20 pages are just full of this great comedy. I love Haddock rushing onto stage with the cow's head.
Yeah, it's so good. They put it on in the end papers as well, and they it's so great. You think you open the book and you think, well, how does that happen? I wonder.
And it's just a beautiful frame where he rushes on stage, and of course it has to be at the moment that the magician is asking someone to come on stage and confirm that it is 40-degree proof Scottish whiskey that he's turned the water into.
Yeah. Who else would burst onto stage at that point? And then they get kicked out twice. It's brilliant. Haddock keeps getting them kicked out of places for being not for being drunk, just for being a complete clumsy oaf. And then you get into the fantastic story, which I've always loved this one. It's because it's a mystery. You know, it's got a little bit of Scooby-Doo about it. Yeah. You know, what are the 7 crystal balls? Is there an Incan mummy on the loose? You know.
Things get pretty scary pretty quickly. I remember being terrified of this book when I read it first time.
Yeah, it's like the fakir, isn't it? In Broken Ear, it's when Tintin dreams that the mummy is coming after him in his dream, and it's really horrible. He appears at the window like a zombie and throws a crystal ball at him. That's a memorable image, isn't it?
What is it, Raskar Kapak?
That's it, Raskar Kapak, yes.
And very similar to the dream sequence in Cigars of the Pharaohs, actually, that kind of hallucinogenic. And we're before the 60s here. I mean, we're still in the mid-40s.
Yeah, and we presume Hergé wasn't taking any mind-expanding drugs. I mean, I don't know.
You
Was
never know.
he? Yeah, and then the fact that it's a two-parter as well means that Hergé can have some fun with the first half of the book. It's like it is at least 20-25 pages before the plot really kicks off, but you've had an introduction to what it's going to be about.
But it doesn't feel padded at all. I mean, every single frame is packed with action or suspense or comedy. And it seems like around this time there was this paper shortage during the war, and the production of Le Soir was becoming more sporadic because of the Nazis losing power and because of this paper shortage. And it gives Hergé more time to focus on the detail of the adventures, and the adventures seem to benefit as a result. Just looking through Seven Crystal Balls, there's almost not a single frame in there that I wouldn't sort of blow up and have on my wall. It's really rich in detail.
It is. It's like pop art, isn't it? It's absolutely classic, and just all these ingredients, and it moves as well for a book it does, like you say, it doesn't have any padding. We're at page 48, 49 already, which is 10 or so pages from the end of the book, when it's what you've had is the chase. You know, they're chasing. They haven't found anything out. They're chasing. Who are these people? Who are these people? And you haven't really. It's a mystery all the way to page 50. And the last 10 pages deal with, well, what's going to happen next, which we can come to, can't we? Because what you were saying earlier.
Yes, and that's really scary. I mean, it's the explorers. It's sort of like this Tutankhamun Inca kind of Tutankhamun curse that seem to have on them, these explorers. And I found it very much like almost like a sort of Amicus or Hammer horror film. The way that is always in the background. It's quite menacing.
Yeah, I was thinking of Amicus too, actually, especially The Beast Must Die, which is a film we're both huge fans of. But I mean, that might be why I love the scenes in the woods, because The Beast Must Die, which, if you haven't seen it, by the way, is an Amicus film from the 70s, starring Peter Cushing, about werewolves. And
a blaxploitation werewolf movie.
It is. Calvin Lockhart plays the rich playboy owner of this mansion in the middle of nowhere, with a wood surrounding it, and the wood is all wired up to spy on people, because he invites people out there, one of whom is a werewolf, and he's going to discover who the werewolf is. And this
funky werewolf.
Yeah, because as soon as the film starts, you know, the beast must die. It goes wow, wow, down, 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 down. But like, oh, okay, the 70s, right? Okay. But that's part of its charm, the fact that it's cheesy as hell in some places. But Seven Crystal Balls, yeah, the fact that it's a two-parter. Hergé gets to spend the first book setting up what are the, there's been another case of this guy found unconscious, and another one, and it builds up. So by the time the book ends and you're ready for the next book, Prisoners of the Sun, you've got this huge mystery where there's these 7 men all in a coma.
Well, hold your horses there, my friend.
Yeah.
Because we're on page 49, and we're down there at the bottom with all of the patients, the explorers, who sort of seem to be having a fit at 10:30 in the morning. Now, that on page 49 was actually to be the last time we see Tintin for quite a while. What happens at the end of page 49, in September 1944, the adventure gets stopped in its tracks when the Allied troops enter Belgium. Hergé's employers at the pirate version of Le Soir, and in fact all the employees of the newspaper, are sacked. Not only that, but anyone who had taken employment in any pirate publication under the Nazis, like Le Soir, was forbidden from working. So Hergé and Jacobs are both soon arrested as traitors. They're thrown in jail, and things are looking pretty bad for Hergé when his anti-Semitic characterizations in the Shooting Star and his previous association with the right-wing 20e siècle newspaper come to light. And in fact, Hergé's name gets listed twice in a leaflet called The Gallery of Traitors, produced by Belgian resistance fighters. So it all is starting to sound rather like a cliffhanger in a Tintin adventure so far. But this is in fact the last time Tintin is seen in the Belgian press for the next 2 years. And in many ways, Hergé's comeuppance seems to have been pretty inevitable. He knew pretty well that he'd been at best opportunistic, I guess, in continuing to work with the pirate Soir. and it always seemed likely that his association with Abbot Valles, the essentially fascist sympathizer, was one day going to cause him some trouble. If you remember, Valles was used to have a signed photo of Mussolini on his desk back in the 20th siècle days. So, in fact, Valles himself was arrested at his monastery and was accused as a collaborator and traitor at multiple trials that lasted until as late as the mid-50s. Hergé himself was arrested as a collaborator and released multiple times during this period by different resistance groups. And a number of his friends and colleagues were arrested, jailed, some were even executed. Later, Hergé said, the result of my naivete at the time was limited to stupidity, one might even say imbecility. I drew for the newspaper Le Soir during the war, which was controlled by the Germans, and I must admit that it should have dealt a death blow to my subsequent career. All of it was looked on poorly after the war, and rightly so, but I had to think about my survival, didn't I? And above all, I never did anything other than draw my comic strips during the war. I did no German propaganda. So it was a pretty hysterical time, and Hergé did feel he was somewhat hard done by for taking what he saw as a neutral position during the war. Of course, he was far from blameless. By publishing any stories in Le Soir, he was arguably helping to promote the Nazi newspaper. During this time, this 2 years that Tintin disappears from the press, Hergé and Jacobs could only continue to work illegally, and they seemed to publish under a pseudonym, Olav, and they tried to carry on working on the colorization and redrawings of the previous Tintin adventures, and they were stockpiling these in the hope that one day they might be able to publish them again. But until Hergé could secure what was known as a certificate of good citizenship in Belgium, he wasn't able to work, he wasn't allowed. But fortunately, in 1945, Hergé would receive the phone call from publisher Raymond Leblanc, which was to save him and Tintin. So Leblanc was a big Tintin fan, and he was a hero of the Belgian resistance. And he was also in a position to put Tintin back in print again and to find Hergé the certificate he needed. And in Hergé's defense at his trial, they argued, and hear me out on this, that by taking up page space in Le Soir newspaper with innocent children's cartoons, Hergé was actually reducing the space available in the newspaper for Nazi propaganda. And therefore, Hergé was doing some sort of public service or patriotic duty for working for the newspaper, which is, I guess, quite a spin to put on things. Anyway, it seemed to work, and it was Leblanc's idea to launch a full-color weekly magazine with Tintin's adventures as the primary focus, called Le Journal de Tintin, or Tintin magazine. And Leblanc also hired Hergé's collaborator Jacobs and also Jacques van Melkebeek as the editor of the magazine. And the magazine launched a year later, 29th of September 1946. And basically, they carried on from where we left off on page 49. So it starts actually, page 50 in the book version of the Seven Crystal Balls starts as a new adventure called The Temple of the Sun, actually, in Tintin magazine. And it really is the start of the quest to find calculus. So it does almost feel like the start of something new. And one thing that I found really interesting was that on page 50, when Hergé starts to write the story again after 2 years and after all he's been through, the first frames that you see there show a very depressed Captain Haddock, essentially slumped in an armchair, with butler Nestor telling Tintin that Captain has aged 10 years since the misfortune struck. And obviously in the book that refers to Calculus's abduction, but I think really that the Captain here really represents Hergé himself and the misfortune of his last troubled few years, being an outcast from society, unable to work. But anyway, Hergé, in this case, it's the captain who receives the phone call with some leads on where Calculus is, just as Hergé had received the phone call from Leblanc, which had put him back in business, and the captain's then back off into the adventure, and Hergé's back writing again. So this 2 years has passed, and yet we're still in the same adventure, albeit with a new name.
Yeah, and it's pretty flawless in terms of the book. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know, because of the way the story builds to page 49. You've got, this is the final act and epilogue. You've got oh, well, this is the low point. We've got these 7 men in a coma. We don't know what's causing it. We're all lost, and then, hang on a minute, there's a clue. And then that builds up the last 10, 11, 12 pages of the book. They decide they're going to have to go on an adventure to find Cuthbert Calculus. They find his hat, all of this, and they get to the end of the book, and they're off on a seaplane. So yeah, it's got that great wrap up. And you bought me this many years ago for my 40th birthday, and now I don't know if this is one of the Tintin.
Yes,
it is. So
yeah, that's Tintin magazine. Yes,
1953, and this was the
yes.
On a marche sur la lune. We all know which that one is, which we'll come to in a few books' time.
Absolutely.
So yeah, this was actually the magazine that he published his new adventures in, which is fantastic. And what a brilliant present that was as well. You got me this, and you got me an original ET poster, which I framed as well. But yeah, that's fascinating that, the book ends with this call to adventure in Prisoners of the Sun. And it just carries on. The adventure just carries on in the next book as if nothing had happened. And we're post-war now, I presume, with Prisoners of the Sun.
Well, yes, we've kind of taken us through to the end of the war and beyond now. And Hergé has this new magazine at his disposal, and kind of a free hand. Still the cloud of his behavior during the war hanging over him to a certain extent. It's really hard to know just reading back through all of this history, it's very hard to put yourself in Hergé's position. I mean, he says a number of things himself. I mean, one of the things he says is that, maybe I was a bit too pessimistic. I thought that, Germany probably would win the war, and we'd just have to get used to that. So, the sooner I just started kind of just getting down to work and thinking about my career, maybe the better. But yeah, that's all a bit.
That's a bit Kent Brunkman, isn't it? I, for one, accept our insect overlords. But it's, it's easy for us to say, the Nazis aren't marching over the face of the earth. And I think, obviously there's a bit of truth in Hergé saying, I was thinking of my career. I needed to keep working. I decided, and he did decide to make the stories very, very escapist and non-political.
Yeah.
And he still had a job. And I think he was what he wanted. He wanted to stay in employment. He wanted to keep writing Tintin and drawing Tintin. So he decided to turn a blind eye and just fly under the radar. But
it does throughout his career. So far, it certainly seems, anything to get Tintin the exposure, that these adventures get them out to the public, regardless of what that means in many cases. But also you have to remember that he still had this mentor in the abbot who was always very, far right and had this kind of connection to Mussolini and had some kind of quite what we would probably see now as quite unpalatable opinions as well.
He certainly wasn't apolitical either. He had his, when he found out about injustice and racism and, just countries being trodden on by other countries and so forth, he did have something to say about it.
Well, we saw that in, Tintin in America about the States and then, the Blue Lotus about Japan and
So yeah, it's complicated. People are complicated. I think these days, people try and slap a label on you. You're either, you're cancelled, or you're a lefty, or you're a fascist. And it's like people are way more complicated than that. I think if someone tells you they're a fascist, you should believe them. But
obviously, Tintin's scepter was very critical of the Nazis and German and Italian fascism.
And maybe Hergé just decided, well, I'm not going to write a story like that. I'm not an idiot. While I'm working for this paper that's being run by, the Third Reich, so I'll just make I'll just make stories for kids. But what we got out of it is some of the most brilliant Tintin stories. So
absolutely. And on that note, on to Peru, and let's talk about llamas.
Yeah, llamas are huge in this book, aren't they? And again, I remembered as I was reading it, because Haddock has a couple of run-ins with spitting llamas. I remembered the punchline of this book. I remember it ends with a llama gag. I was like, this is going to end with a llama gag. But I'd actually forgotten the llama gag it does end with, which is a nice twist. I thought Haddock got spat at in the last panel by another llama. They always used to put the Thompsons in the sea as a final punchline. Like, oh, the Thompsons have fallen in the sea again. But this one has Haddock getting revenge, which is great. But yeah, this is a classic one. This one, I think it's a nice Peruvian adventure, jungle. As I said to you the other day, it's got that amazing 39 steps scene where Tintin jumps off the runaway train off the bridge into the river.
Yeah, the runaway train, that's beautifully drawn, isn't it? Really suspenseful.
It's brilliant. I mean, also there's some real panicky moments in there. First of all, Tintin's about to jump off and realizes he's left Snowy asleep in the compartment, which is just, don't leave your dog in the train. Goes back to get him. So it's a save the cat moment, except it's a save the dog moment. So Tintin, good person. Haddock lands in a giant cactus, which is great. That's of course where he would land. But yeah, it's sort of action from the start. They're on a boat, they're on a train. Soon they'll be on a plane, I think. But there's and then suddenly they're in the on a snowy mountainside, and this is all in the first half of the book.
The snow scenes, I think these might be the first color snow scenes in any Hergé book. I could be wrong, but they were absolutely beautiful. You can see why he comes back. Hergé comes back and does Tintin in Tibet, because those frames are just incredibly beautiful. And there's quite a body count here, I think, as well. You don't really see it happening, but where there's the avalanche and they all kind of roll into these snowballs and they're rolling down the hill, Captain just happens to bump into a rock, I think, to stop him going over the edge of the cliff. But there's like lots of snowballs with people in them that seem to go straight off the end of a cliff. That's
brilliant. That I almost wish, if I had one criticism of this book, I almost wish it had some big frames and bigger frames in it, because it's got one very good one at the end of the Inca temple.
Oh yeah.
Particularly that one with all the snowballs would have made a brilliant half page.
It would.
And I love the punchline of that, which is, Zorino, Tintin says, the captain's guardian angel has a full-time job. Because that's very cinematic. And I hope I've got a feeling they might put that into the second film, the Spielberg. I don't know which one. I think they might be doing these ones.
Well, I was going to ask about that. Have you heard anything on the Hollywood grapevine?
No, the last thing I heard or read was that it was in, quote, development hell, but I think that's to do with the fact that Spielberg and Jackson are very, very busy. We've had the pandemic on, everything. So I think it's probably going to get made in a couple of years. I think it's still planned. But that sequence with the rolling snowballs would make a fantastic dramatic scene. You can just see it. They're making a huge spectacle of it, and it also reminds me of it again. It's very Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. You've got
this one particularly is. I know you mentioned Indiana Jones in pretty much every single episode, but this one in particular is very Indiana Jones.
Yeah. You've got snakes, jungles, plane crashes, alligators, everything. A waterfall they have to jump through, all of that kind of stuff. It's the stuff of Indiana Jones. Dreams, isn't it? It's very good.
And now, I mean, one of the reasons why they might not have been able to put in more larger frames and panels into this particular adventure is, and we know quite a lot about this now, because one of our viewers, Anthony, has some of the original 1946 French versions from the Tintin magazine of this Temple of the Sun adventure. It was called Temple of the Sun in Tintin magazine, and originally, those cartoon strips were published actually in landscape format. So rather than the usual portrait format, it would be published in landscape format, 3 lines deep across 2 pages. And Hergé seems to have had a huge workload on the new magazine because he had to film so much space with additional content. Anyway, this weird format and the extra related content in the magazine meant that it was very hard when Hergé finished to know if this adventure was going to fit the 62-page standard Casterman Tintin book format. And apparently a considerable period of reworking happened. And the adventure was found to be just far too long to fit into the 62-page format. So they actually had to cut a lot out. And I think that's probably why they weren't able to put in some of these larger panels as well.
Because there's so much happening, isn't there? And yeah, that landscape version, which you showed me, is so beautiful. I mean, it's a real collector's item. It's so unusual because we're used to seeing Tintin in an A4 portrait format.
Yes.
And see it in landscape is so unusual. If I saw that in a shop, I'd want it immediately. You know, it's really beautiful.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is, again, it's pure escapism with a bit of magic thrown, isn't it? I actually forgot about the voodoo subplot in this as well.
Yeah, it's strange because it's a bit like Sherlock Holmes usually with Tintin, that there seems to be something quite mystical going on, but it all turns out to be something pretty run-of-the-mill. But in this particular adventure, there are effigies that the modern Incas are, I don't know if they're sticking pins in them or something, but it seems to be having a real effect in these explorers back in the hospital.
Yeah, it's like Scooby-Doo as well, isn't it, Tintin? It's always Old Man Withers who runs the amusement park. And curses the Scooby gang at the end for their meddling. But yeah, in fact, it's a mix of stuff because you're like, okay, yeah, so they drugged them, that's why they passed out. But why were they having these fits? I thought, while I was rereading it, I thought, oh, it's because of the drug or something. They've drugged them with something that makes them fit every few hours or something. But it wasn't that. It was voodoo dolls.
It really was voodoo.
Yeah, and then like the Incan magic and all that, talking about, and then Tintin calls upon, obviously he realizes that next week there's an eclipse, so he uses it to trick the Incas into thinking that he can command the sun, which is, again, it's clever. And
it is clever. Yeah, apparently Hergé was quite embarrassed about that because by this stage he prides himself on his meticulous research work, and I think he used various sources to get this right, the details of Peru and Inca civilization. But I think it was pretty clear even to Hergé that the Incas would know a lot about the way that the sun and moon worked, and they would have been quite aware what solar eclipse was, and probably would have even known that it was about to happen. So I think he felt that was a bit of an embarrassment.
Well, it's a bit cartoony, isn't it? But it works in the state of the book in terms of, he won't tell Haddock. I mean, he could show Haddock the newspaper and go, "Oh, look, Captain, there's going to be an eclipse next week, so don't worry about it." But instead, he keeps him.
He doesn't trust him.
Really? Haddock thinks he's going to die.
That does seem a bit cruel, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. But let's not forget as well, page 57, 58, 59, you've got, each one ends with the Thompsons in a different part of the world because they've gone on they've used the dowsing rod to try and find calculus, and they end up in Egypt. Oh, they're in a hot spot, and then they're getting bumped about, and they're at the Dodgems and stuff, and then it just cuts them with a couple of penguins. North Pole. It's just a lovely way of shoehorning the Thompsons in at the end. And I imagine every week or every other week, it's like each story page must have ended with the Thompsons in a different part of the world for a big laugh. I love the fact that they're on there. Again, that would be great for the movie. It ends with them they're doing their own world tour, but they're nowhere near where they're supposed to be, which I thought was lovely.
Yeah.
Just throw away last panel on a few pages there.
And there's this. There's also the lovely character of Zorino, the native Peruvian boy, which is very much in the mold of Chang, who
Chang,
who Tintin just acts as protector for and protects him from the initial attackers. And then at the end gives him this medallion that he's been given, some kind of protection amulet, which means that Zorino gets saved, whereas Tintin and the captain have to face certain death, which ends up not being certain death.
No, I love the way they get, they go through that temple and they find the two jolly zombies, as Haddock said.
And the waterfall, how they get into they go behind the waterfall, which is just a beautiful idea.
I love that. And I've seen it done in a few times in movies like Last of the Mohicans and Lost World, Jurassic Park. They have, and also Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I think they go through a waterfall to get to. But on page 47, you've got that fantastic bit where it's a half page where they crash in on the Incan temple.
Yeah.
And that's the point at which the camera pulls right back, as it were. And
that's a beautiful frame.
Fantastic, so dramatic, and it's mostly just temple wall.
Yeah.
And a sense of scale there, which is just really needed at that moment.
And then they're essentially sentenced to death, and they're waiting for death, and it just feels again like almost a Hergé self-referential about Hergé was really knowing that the resistance fighters were one day going to come calling, and there was going to be some sort of price to pay for his collusion with the Soir newspaper and other previous work that he'd done. And it feels again that he's sort of telling his own story a bit through the adventure here.
Yeah, I didn't think of that, but I guess he says, we're in the hands of the gods. Except they're not, because he knows that the sun is going to eclipse next week. So he's kind of saying, look, there's nothing we can do about it, but let's not worry, which is quite a good ethos, really, when you're facing the gallows. Is there anything we can do about it? No, but of course he knew he was going to be all right, which is slightly different.
So on the 7 crystal balls scale, what would you give the 7 crystal balls and Prisoners of the Sun?
As one score. Ironically, I'm not going to give them 7 crystal balls. Unlike last week where we did Red Rackham's Treasure and Secret the Unicorn, because those two I love them, they're classic, and I know them so well, and personally I think they're fantastic. These, I had to remind myself of how great these are, but in the end I think I'm going to give them a 6 because they're not my favorites, but they are brilliant. So personally, I would rank them slightly under Red Rackham's Treasure and Secret the Unicorn. So I'm going to give them a 6.
I'm going to do the exact opposite. I gave last week. I gave the 2 seafaring adventures a 6. This one, I think I fell in love with these 2 adventures when I was very young. I love the mysticism of the whole thing. There's a real underlying menace about it. It's kind of slightly Hammer and Amicus-esque, and you know how much I like all of that stuff. And I just think the detail in there, the imagery is just beautiful. So I'm going to give these a 7.
You're going to give 7 crystal balls, 7 crystal balls.
That's right.
Well, that seems perfectly right. That seems perfectly reasonable, Marcus. Yes. Yeah, I understand why you would do that as well. I think
it's going to be. I think it's going to be difficult with the next few books because we're in such a golden age of Hergé now. It's hard to start to say, oh well, this isn't quite as good, or this isn't quite worthy of a 7, or they're all just brilliant adventures from now.
Oh, they're all fantastic, but it's quite fun to rate them, isn't it? Because you in the end, someone will come along and say, oh, my favorite's the Calculus Affair, and you're like, okay, fair enough. And actually, speaking of Calculus Affair, which is in 4 books' time, that's why I used to confuse 7 crystal balls with Calculus Affair. I think some of the elements of 7 crystal balls made it into Calculus Affair, didn't they?
Yeah, possibly. I can't remember the Calculus Affair very well now. I mean, that seems to be more of a sort of Cold War story, but I'm going to have to read it again to remind myself of all that.
Yeah, and I guess next week, Land of Black Gold, which we'll do as a standalone, even though it has elements of leading into the Moon double bill, it's not really, you don't have to link it to those, do you?
Although that is the next book, it actually was originally started as one of the previous books, which I think we mentioned a few weeks ago. So we'll go into that story next week as well.
Yes, is that because it was a pre-war thing? The war came along and you had to put it on hold. Is that right?
Yeah, it was another kind of another wrong place, wrong time thing. Anyway, we'll go into all of that next week.
We'll come to it, but
just to bring things up to date. So Hergé obviously has his new magazine, and you'd have thought he'd have been over the moon to be back in print with a dedicated weekly Tintin magazine, working with his collaborators again, and with no direct affiliation to any political publication anymore. But actually, the truth is, he felt he'd been offered a bad financial package for the magazine, and also the 2 full pages of Tintin adventures that were demanded by the magazine each week also meant that he sort of returned to his pre-war position of being stretched too thinly and working at every hour. But given that Raymond Leblanc had essentially saved his career, possibly saved his life, Hergé felt that he was in no position to turn down the offer. And Tintin magazine was an immediate success. It started selling, it was soon selling 100,000 copies per week in Belgium and Holland. However, Hergé's troubles continued when the magazine's editor, Van Melkebeek, was arrested for having worked illegally during the war, and he was sent to prison. Hergé then had a fallout with his collaborator Jacobs when Jacobs demanded equal billing for the Tintin adventures, and the pair went their separate ways. But that again just added to Hergé's workload. So the trial of Le Soir journalists had taken its toll on Hergé, of course. And despite being acquitted, he'd lost many of his friends, many of his colleagues as a result. And also his mother had suffered a mental breakdown towards the end of the war. And by the time she died in 1946, sadly, she wasn't even able to recognize Hergé. And all of this really contributes to Hergé's own worsening depression. And also Hergé's relationship with his wife starts to deteriorate after the war around this point. So in June 1947, shortly after Hergé's 40th birthday, he disappears mid-Tintin adventure. And this is during the last book that we've talked about. And the magazine is forced to print a notice which reads, "Our friend Hergé is in need of a rest. Oh, don't worry, he's fine. But in refusing to marshal his forces to bring you a new episode of the Temple of the Sun each week, our friend is a little overworked." So Hergé does return to the magazine, but in order to reduce the burden of having to draw so much in this new magazine format, some additional space was given to other features in the magazine, like a Who Were the Incas feature. So in early 1948, Hergé went AWOL again, this time for 6 weeks. And he actually only came back to the magazine when Leblanc threatened to bring in other cartoonists and writers to complete the Temple of the Sun adventure in his place. Anyway, after all of this, the double adventure finally draws to a close on the 22nd of April, 1948, over 4 years after it had first started. 7 Crystal Balls appears in colour book format from Casterman in 1948, and Prisoners of the Sun follows in 1949, and both were translated into English and published in 1962. I think in 1969, the 2 adventures were made into an animated feature-length film by Belvision, who'd done a lot of the early cartoons, and apparently the results were pretty poor. I think I have seen it. Have you seen that one?
Yeah, I've seen that one. I never liked the style. It just felt like they'd not translated the subtleties of the line art, and everything just felt slightly off.
Yeah. Tintin was like wearing blue jeans or something.
Something like that. It just wasn't quite right. And, you know, I like the new cartoon, the 90s cartoon. I think it's 90s. Again, I like it, but it's not the book.
Yeah.
The purity of these issues is just something quite special. I don't think it can be quite copied, but that's just my opinion. You know, lots of people love the cartoons. Temple of the Sun movie, though, yeah, I remember it being a bit shonky.
Okay, well, I will see you next week in the land of black gold.
Fantastic. All I remember about that one is it's on the cover, the Thompsons hiccuping a lot and growing big green beards.
Back to the psychedelia. Fantastic. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.